Welcome to part 2 of the biological approach. Before we start, I just wanted to show you, I got this Sigmund Freud action figure from a student a few years ago. It was actually in the box and I took it out so I could play with it. Big mistake because all he does is smoke and talk about my mom, which is like awkward and weird. So I just want to let you know that Freud is joining us today. Hello, guten Tag. Yeah, so that's Freud. Okay, so let's talk about part 2 of the biological approach, which is this lecture right here. Okay, so biological approach part 2, we're going to talk about temperament, and then we're going to talk about some evolutionary perspective stuff. Okay, so let's start with temperament. The book talks a lot about temperament. I want to just kind of go through what I think is important about that part of the textbook. So the first idea is, what is the definition of temperament? Temperament is a term referring to the personality of babies. So it's the idea that some people say, like, oh, my baby sleeps all the time. So it seems to be kind of a sleepy baby. I don't know if we would want to use terms like lazy for a baby. That seems kind of judgy. But basically a really calm, kind of sleepy baby, as opposed to a baby that's really active and happy. There might be babies who cry all the time and seem like they're really kind of upset about everything. They don't like loud noises. They don't like change. So parents will often kind of diagnose the personality of their babies, and the term that we have for infant personality is temperament. So I want to talk about babies? No. Freud, stay down. Okay, so he had some weird ideas about babies, right? Okay, so the idea is that this has interesting implications for the biological approach to personality, because the theory is, if personality is biologically driven, and if we can basically sort of assess your personality when you're an infant, then the biological perspective might argue that your personality that you had as an infant should stick with you for the rest of your life. There should be consistency across time. So the people who study personality from this kind of temperament perspective usually have their own coding system for personality of babies. The book actually talks about a couple of studies that do this and talks about their different coding structures. So they have like active babies versus not active babies, responsive babies versus non-responsive babies, things like that. An example of a coding scheme that seems to be fairly popular for people who do this research is to code an infant's personality based on 3 different things. So the first is the baby's emotionality. Does it seem to express a lot of emotions? Is it kind of a moody baby? Activity is, does it walk around a lot? Does it explore its environment, or does it kind of stay put? And then sociability. Does it respond positively when new people come into the environment and pick it up and talk to it, or does it respond badly to that and cry and kind of want to withdraw? So one thing that you can do for fun is the personality test for this week that's available for you on Canvas is a measure of your adult temperament. It was designed by Buss and Plomin, and it's available on Canvas. You can go ahead and rate yourself. Emotionality is going to be the first 3 subscales on that test, and then there's a subscale for activity and sociability. So I encourage you to go ahead and fill that scale out just for fun to see how you fall on baby personality. Okay, so if we're going to test the idea that your temperament as a baby follows you through life, the best way to do that would be with longitudinal studies that actually follow individuals through some period of time. And there have been a lot of studies that have attempted to do this. So the book mentions 3 specifically. The New York longitudinal study was a really well-known, famous study because it was kind of a pioneering study on temperament and following people longitudinally. So that study did find consistency across personality from infants up through adolescence, but it was criticized because it was parents observing and rating their kids. It didn't involve any kind of observational coding from people who had been trained to do that. It didn't involve experimental studies in any way. It was the parents. So the argument was maybe the parents were biased. The next one was the Buss and Plomin article that was used to develop the scale that you can take that's available on Canvas. And then another one was Kagan, who improved on what the New York study had done by actually bringing in infants and following them through their childhood and observing them in the lab. So a little bit more objective. All three of those studies found that your temperament as an infant does follow you at least through early adulthood. So there was some early evidence that this temperament idea had something to it. And so that was used by a lot of people and is still used to argue in favor of the biological perspective. One study that was not in your book that I want to mention just because it was pretty famous was a study published in 2000 by Caspi, but this had been a 30-year longitudinal study, so that's one of the reasons that it's famous. And because Caspi studied kids born in the city called, I think it's pronounced Dunedin in New Zealand, so there's a little map of where that is. And in that city, he actually got 91% of the kids born in that city within a 2-year period to be participants in his study. So that's really, really good. He observed the infants and coded them into one of 3 temperament styles or types. So he called them under-controlled. These were the babies that were impulsive and restless. Inhibited babies were fearful, shy. They didn't really respond very well to environmental stimuli. And then well-adjusted were sort of the healthy, happy babies who seems to be, in a pretty good mood most of the time. So he coded them as infants, and then he followed them through their first third of their lives, probably. And so he followed them into young adulthood, not follow like in a creepy way, but he had them come back to be in research studies over that period of time. And he did find consistency across their personality in that sort of 30-year period of time. So the babies who had been labeled as under controlled, as they grew up, they in fact did have more problems with fighting, lying, disobedience, more criminal behavior, more relationship problems. So they seemed to be kind of lacking in self-regulation and self-discipline, just like we had seen when they were infants. The inhibited babies also, as they grew up, still showed more worrying, more anxiety, more depression. So this is another study that does seem to provide some evidence for the idea of temperament, and that if you have sort of a happy baby, they'll be more likely to be happy as they grow up, and vice versa. So again, evidence for this biological consistency across our lifespan. So the second big point for this particular mini lecture is the idea of personality being affected by evolutionary ideas. So of course you're familiar with Charles Darwin. You know that he published the book on the origin of the species, but he published several other books, one of which was the expression of the emotions in man and animals. So he was interested in how evolutionary ideas influence our emotions and our personalities. One of the ideas that ties into this is what's called the universality hypothesis. The universality hypothesis is that regardless of culture, everywhere around the world seems to have 6 basic emotions and facial expressions that reflect those emotions. So you can see the 6 basic emotions on the slide here, and the idea is that in every culture around the world that we've ever studied, these 6 emotions seem to exist, and we all have the same facial expressions. So you can take photographs of people experiencing these emotions in a country like the United States and show them to people in all over bunch of other countries all over the world, and people recognize the emotions being displayed instantly. So there does seem to be some sort of genetic or universal sort of influence over our personality and our emotions. So 2 more modern books that have been published on this idea are Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene and then Sapolsky's Behave. Richard Dawkins' book actually came out around 40 years ago, but it was the idea that we don't really have much control over our behaviors or our personalities, and that genes are kind of selfishly propagating themselves. So the behaviors that we will do successfully are the ones that get our genes into the next generation. And then Behave, I actually have the book right here, I'm reading it. It's kind of long though, so I'm not done. But he was actually the speaker at last year's MUPSI conference. And so his book is all about basically the biology of human behavior, including personality, and how biology drives us to do our best and our worst actions. So I encourage you to check that out for some light reading if you have the time. Okay, so the basic idea of the evolutionary perspective for personality is that the behaviors that we do are chosen through natural selection, meaning that behaviors that successfully lead people to survive longer and to reproduce are the ones that are passed on to the next generation. So we have inherited the behaviors that helped our ancestors survive and help them have reproductive opportunities, even if those behaviors are outdated by today's standards. So we still crave sugary, fatty foods, even though we have plenty of options at the grocery store now. We don't have to go hunt for our food. So we still have that tendency, even though it's not as helpful as it used to be. But those genes will continue to exist in the gene pool as long as they don't hurt our survival or reproductive ability. So an example that Sapolsky actually talks about in this big book that I did read, this part of it, is he talks about the effect of testosterone on our personality. So we usually think of testosterone as being something that drives aggression, and that's sometimes true, but in fact, what testosterone seems to be doing is driving our personality trait of competitiveness. So if you're a generally competitive person, you might have a higher level of testosterone than some other people. And the idea is that on average, men have more testosterone, and men are, according to this research, more competitive than women in a traditional definition of competition. But it doesn't necessarily mean aggression. So for example, he talks in this book about how if you put people in a setting where being nice and empathetic actually gets you the most status, that's what testosterone will bring out. So a specific example of this is if you're at a charity auction. At a charity auction for like rich people where you're giving money to like St. Jude Hospital or something like that, the highest status goes to the people who give the most money. That's not aggression, but it's still competitive. So people who are higher in testosterone give more money at charity auctions. It has nothing to do with aggression. It's about winning, basically. So you can win by being aggressive in some situations, and you can win by being nice in other situations. And the testosterone actually is correlated with people who want to win, not necessarily be aggressive. It's just that aggression is often tied to winning in our society. So I think that's kind of an interesting biological finding. A lot of the research from this perspective talks about sex differences. So male personality versus female personality. An example of that is what I just talked about with the testosterone. This is described for you in the book. But the general idea is that men had more survival and reproductive success by being kind of physically strong and aggressive. Women had more survival and reproductive success by being nice and nurturing and caring for other people and babies. And so the difference between male personality and female personality as a stereotype is the idea that that's what benefited our ancestors. So the book talks about things like mate preferences. Men are looking for heterosexual partners who are younger, who are physically attractive because that's a cue for genetic health. Women, on the other hand, are looking for heterosexual male partners who are a little bit older, and that's because they probably have more status and therefore more resources in society. Another gender difference or sex difference is in what makes us jealous. So the idea here is that heterosexual men will be more jealous when their partners are going to show sexual infidelity. So when they cheat on you by having sex with someone. And the idea for that is because of paternity uncertainty. So if she gets pregnant, now we don't know if the baby is mine or his. So they basically want to protect their sexual access to their woman. As opposed to women don't really care if a man goes out and has sex with a woman, according to this perspective, because even if she gets pregnant, like that's not as big of a deal as making sure that if he's my man, I'm getting his money and his resources, basically. So the concern for women isn't so much sexual infidelity as emotional infidelity. If you fall in love with her and you marry her, then she gets your resources. So for men, it's concern about sex, whereas for women, it's concern about, are you in love with her? So this is very sexist. It goes to very traditional, stereotypical ideas about what men and women are and what they're like. There are also cultural explanations for these exact same differences and how we raise boys and girls to care about different things. So this is very controversial, but it's one piece of evidence that some use for a biological driver of personality. That's it for section 2. I'll see you for section 3.